So it's 11 and we'll try and start on time. So we'll get going. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar in LEAP's Family Leadership series called Creating Community in the Street Where You Live with Cormac Russell, who we're really pleased to have here with us today. I'm going to introduce Cormac in a moment, and I'll just tell you a little bit first about these webinar series. So the Family Leadership series are intended to provide a rich resource for families who want to pursue an inclusive life for their son or daughter, brother or sister, or for themselves. Each webinar has been designed to assist families to think about, plan for, and take action on inclusion. So I'm really happy, as I say, to introduce Cormac Russell. And Cormac is the founder of Nurture Development, and Nurture Development seeks to support communities to reduce institutionalization and increase interdependency in community life. Over the last 25 years, Cormac's work has demonstrated an enduring impact in 35 countries around the world. He has trained communities, agencies, non-governmental organizations, sometimes called NGOs, and governments in asset-based community development and other community-based approaches in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, and North America. His most recent book is called Rekindling Democracy, A Professional's Guide to Working in Citizen Space. And I have my own well-thumbed copy here, Cormac, and it really is a super book. And if people are interested in purchasing that, myself and Cormac can put up a link at the end, a really, really super book. So welcome, Cormac, to LEAP's Family Leadership Series. We're really happy to have you here with us today. And just before we get going, it may be useful just to do a little housekeeping. And can I draw everybody's attention to the chat function at the bottom of your screen and encourage you to put any questions or comments in the chat box. We've already got one in there already, so that's super. We really want to hear from you today and get a sense of how this webinar connects. Also, in terms of a few ground rules, everyone comes as a family member and an ally, including Cormac, and this is the spirit in which you're invited today. So I'm going to hand over to Cormac and we'll begin our discussion. And one of the things, Cormac, that I'd really like you to reflect on just at the very beginning of this session is, what do you think, and it's a big question and it's early in the morning on a Friday, so apologies. What do you think that the pandemic has revealed to us, perhaps, about the importance of community?
That's a great question. And I think it's an important question, Rachel. Firstly, thanks for having me on. And hello to everyone that's joining the webinar this morning. It's great that you're with us. It's an awful shame that we can't all see each other, but you know, it's great to be part at least of a conversation, and we will make sure to include you as we go along this morning. Myself and Rachel, most likely in between a little bit of presentation from me, will have that bit of banter and a bit of Q&A and whatever, just to kind of liven it up and make it feel human. So in terms of what it's revealed, I guess I love that idea that, you know, the world is full of magical, interesting things waiting for our senses to grow sharper. I think it was Yeats that said that, W.B. Yeats. And I think every so often things happen that just are revelational. They call your attention to it in a way that you wouldn't have attended to it otherwise. And I think about a year ago, what the pandemic did was it really helped us to see that we're as healthy as our sickest neighbor. That sort of level of you can't be independent unless you're interdependent is not something that most of us go around holding as a thought in our head. Unless, like, you're somebody who's been to the edge of community and you know how awful it is to be lonely or to be isolated, then you probably know how interdependent you are, and because you feel the pain of being disconnected, you know. But here was something called a pandemic that actually rubbed our noses in the fact that we are our brother's sister's planet's keeper. And if we don't get our act together, nature will kick us in the butt. And you know, all of this sort of silly nonsense that's going on, it's missing that point, that communities are actually the front line. They are the first responders. I have a brother, you know, with various labels. Our mother died on April 1st, a month into the pandemic. My brother was able to be there. I wasn't, because I couldn't travel out of county. So I watched her burial on FaceTime. And says, you know, so what it reveals is a fragility, a human fragility, but it also reveals an incredible, and I think often invisible set of capacities that exist in our communities. I saw it in places like in the parish of Rushen on the Isle of Man, where at street level they all organized neighbor to neighbor to neighbor to watch out for each other over the period of March and April. You know, because the services essentially went home. The service, that's the other thing that happened, by the way. The services largely for March, April, May, June disappeared. So you had this kind of situation where the services, for the first time in probably 100 years, disappeared largely, you know, and a whole set of things that would have been done in service land, schooling, surgery, procedures, a whole set of functions, right, that would have been in the world of service land were no longer available to us. And then we started to see something for the first time in a terrible long time. And the eye of the poet sees this all the time, you see, but you know, the busy eye, the eye that has to get up and make a living and come back and get up and do it again tomorrow morning, finds it very hard to see what really became visible. But what came visible there, I think, for that few months was as the institutional world hit the limits of its capacity, what happened to the community? It started to get into its stride, right? And then something curious happened. As the institutional world started to get back into its stride around the back end of the summer into autumn, it was almost as like, I mean, some of you will remember this, by the way. We have 30 odd people on the call. I'm sure we have enough collective memory to know this, right? So just do a basic analysis of this. This time last year on your Facebook accounts, you would have seen story after story about people in Italy serenading their neighbors, and people in you know, East Wall playing bingo in hazmat suits and all kinds of wonderful things, right? Absolutely bonkers stuff, right? But beautiful, and very safe. So very sophisticated, very compliant. We're all scared. Do you remember that stage? We didn't know if you could even touch a surface. And we were sneezing into our elbows and washing our hands 50 times a day and whatever. So we were all very frightened, but we were also all very mindful of trying to watch out for each other. So it was almost as if the institutional world hit the limits of its capacity and the community world started to get into its sense of itself. And I think that's also something that's been revealed. Sadly, over the summer period, as the institutions came back, we started to see a lot of those mutual aid groups, a lot of that mutuality, I would say, get gaslighted. We saw agencies engaging in humble bragging. Oh, it wasn't anything we particularly did, but look at all the things we did. And, you know, you have agencies that were nearly sticking their logos on people's foreheads and claiming that it was them that did it, as opposed to actually cheering on the local associational life, the families, the extraordinary but very ordinary ways that people showed up in each other's lives, right? And actually now what you can see, because of course you can't just say, what did the pandemic reveal? Because the pandemic has gone waves, right? So as we became more disillusioned and institutions came back more and more, I think we've kind of gone into a wave of not being quite sure where to put our 2 feet as communities. We're neither here nor there, because in a lot of ways we've nearly been treated as we're at one or two extremes. Either we're virus spreaders, which I suppose we are in technical terms, right? And in that category you have the compliant and the non-compliant, right? Or you go to the other extreme and you have people who are conspiracy theorists. And of course, what we're in now is a public health crisis, and millions of more people would have died. I'm sure the evidence is clear on this. From an academic perspective, millions of more people would have died on this planet, but for the strength of community around the world. There's no doubt about it. I would say it would be very, very hard to find evidence that's being gathered that actually lifts up what communities have been doing. So that's the big sadness I have, that institutions have come in and have kind of moved into that dominant role again, instead of lifting up and celebrating and actually investing in what is it we've learned? Because there will be other pandemics. And we need to know what it is we did so we can do it again the next time.
Yes, yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Cormac. And I think certainly for me and in my community, what has been revealed is that, we cannot live well without community, and that in the busyness and the hurly-burly of life pre-pandemic, when we were jumping in our cars and traveling all over the place and so on, some of us, we missed what was right in front of us, which was the value of the assets in the local community. And what asset-based community development does then is try and mobilize and connect the assets in a local community. So perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, you might take us through the approach of asset-based community development, and particularly in a way that will resonate with citizens, with family members, with ordinary people. Thank you, Cormac.
Not at all. Now, I have a slideshow, and it might just be nice to have a few images. I'm always cautious about PowerPoints, because I think, that the power is in the conversation and the point is us connecting, but just given the format that we're in, it might be useful.
Please do.
So let's do that. I'll share it like this, because when I go to full screen, I actually lose. Now, by the way, if you are watching this on Zoom, there's a little trick on Zoom. If you quite like to see people's faces while you're watching the slideshow, you can kind of shrink the slideshow a little bit by moving the bar, and that it kind of makes our faces bigger. If that's what you're into, you may not be, may try to do it the other way, but that's an option available to you. So as Rachel said, I mean, one of the things I'm very interested in, and it's a bit of a jawbreaker, is this idea of rekindling democracy. And a simple way of saying that is, I have some kindling here, right? This is kindling that I got from a forest nearby. And I often think that people, are kind of, they're a bit like people crouched over kindling, right? Waiting for somebody else to light their fire, and I think what's interesting about citizens is, what citizens tend to do is they find, and kindling, of course, is a bit of a, it's a bit of a metaphor for life, but they find the little bit of kindling in their lives, and then they figure out innovative ways of setting it alight. So instead of waiting for somebody else to light their fire, they're figuring out how to light their own. And that doesn't mean they're solving all of their own problems. But the reason I wrote a book, with such a grand title as Rekindling Democracy, was I felt in a lot of ways that we're in this really, really vulnerable time, or fragile time in a sense, and critical time, where a very significant number of people think that their health is in the hands of a doctor. They think that their child's education is in the hands of a teacher. They think that their safety is in the hands of the police officers. And they think that their political democratic futures are in the hands of politicians. And I'm not going to slag off any of those professions, But what I am going to say is I think that's kind of back to front. Because I think in a strong democracy, and just to be well, forget democracy for a second, I think what we have to convince ourselves of is this idea that in a democracy, families, citizens, people are at the center, not professionals. And that the professionals are there to back us up, not to do our living for us or to us. Now, this is important both for the professionals, because if we start expecting them to do our health and our safety and our joy and our life for us, they'll burn out because they can't do it on their own. It doesn't make any sense. So in a sense, rekindling democracy, Rachel, and asset-based community development says the role of the professional is defined as that which happens after the important work of the family and the neighbor is done. And there is no professional and there is no funding that can replace that work. And the minute you as a family member try to get a professional to do it for you, you're handing your power away and you are creating a road to a dissatisfied life. And you will spend the rest of your days knocking your head off the brick wall of the empire. And it's not the route to well-being. That's the harsh reality. I found nothing to convince me of others. And I know that as somebody who is, an advocate for my brother in the Irish context, right? And I know that as somebody who's worked around the world. So let me just kind of unpack that a little bit. If we were to kind of say, so how do we put families and ordinary folks living in places back in the center of the action, right? How do we put them in the driving seat? Because at the moment, what's happening, I think, and we find it even in our family experience, if we're not careful, right? That to use the metaphor of the car, the institutions are nearly always in the driving seat, Rachel, right? That's kind of the impulse. It's an imperial impulse. And bless them, there's reasons for that. I mean, people can lose their job if they don't act like they know where they're going and they're driving in the right direction. But the problem you see around that is while that probably is useful if you're a professional, it's terribly disabling if you're a family member or if indeed you're a citizen. Because what at best you end up with is a situation where you're in the backseat and at worst on the side of the road. So you're really you're not steering your own course. You're a consumer rather than a producer. And that's a big issue. Now, aside from that, what's also really interesting is, and there's a lot of words here, I'll just talk them through. The evidence is really clear. If you want your family member to have a job, for example, a meaningful, somewhere to live, someone to love, something meaningful and purposeful to do in life, there's 7 probably documents I have in my desk, probably more, I haven't counted them, that are just about this at the moment because we're doing some work on this. All of the evidence is really clear that if that person has connections and good networks in a community, they're at least 4 times more likely to get some kind of a sustainable job, some kind of a sustainable, purposeful occupation, a meaningful way of contributing to themselves, their economy, their family, and their community. Without that, I don't care how good the jobs club is or the professional is, in fairness to them, they can't do it on their own. And here's the news as well, Rachel, the family can't do it on their own. So in some ways, that kind of relationship building into those relationships, it's not who you know or what you know, but it's who you know, who knows, who you need to know.
And it's getting into the right relationship, isn't it, Cormac?
Sure. It's not just any relationship. It's about relationships that really see the person for the person, see them for their gifts, for their contributions. And also, they say a gift is not a gift until it's given, but of course, it's also not a gift until it's received. And this is a big issue for families. You can do all of, the important work of supporting somebody you love who maybe hasn't had a valued social role and probably has had all kinds of knockbacks and can be exiled out of communities and bullied and had bad experiences, traumatic experiences. And you say, community is the last thing I want to trust, because the story is these are hostile places that don't love the people I love. They do the opposite. They hurt them. They isolate them. They don't see them as I see them, you see. And so this is a really hard message, because the last thing you want to say to anybody on a call like this or any other conversation is you must go and build community relations. But what we are saying is that if by whatever means, through the small amount of kindling you can find islands of welcome in a neighborhood, places and people who can see the gifts of your child, your loved one, and you as a family member, and can actually say, God, do you know what? Where have you been all my life? And how have we ever done this without you? So they can create that welcome. And across our experience, whether it is around jobs or even safety, you know, how many people have loved ones who have experienced feeling unsafe psychologically, physically in neighborhoods? But equally, it has to be said, in institutions too. So, you know, how do we create places of safety? Well, again, we do that through stronger neighborhoods. And the interesting thing over and over again is we're learning, and we're doing some work together on this, Rachel and I, is that communities, as we understand them, the Irish context, the parish, the estate, the village, you know, however you frame the small bounded place, they're often places that are quite disconnected. You know, we were talking about the pandemic and whatnot, but not all communities are connected. Many, you know, are more likely to be watching an episode of the American sitcom Friends or the Australian program Neighbours than they are to be making friends with their neighbours. So there's a lot of work actually, and this is the not so good news. There's a lot of work that needs to go into building stronger neighbourhoods. And sadly, in the Irish context, very, very little has actually gone into investing in strengthening our neighborhoods. A lot's gone into working with different categories of people. So we have any amount of programs working with people, young people, older people, you know, people who are labeled in certain ways. But hardly any work actually goes into building hospitable communities. So more and more, as I think about it in the Irish context, and again, this is a piece of work that Rachel and I are going to do, I think we have to take it into our own hands, quite frankly. I think we have to go native, and we have to start figuring out ways that the people who've been defined as having a problem become the people who redefine the problem. You know, that's what I want to talk a little bit. Incidentally, because Rachel mentioned around well-being, in places where we've gotten serious about building community, like Frome in Somerset, the building of those networks has actually reduced isolation and reduced the need for GP visits and hospitalization by 17%. Now, in that exact same county over that 3-year period, there was an increase in emergency hospital admissions by something like, I think, 29%. So you look at the difference. It's phenomenal. So as well as, I mean, you would always hope these things can come to pass, but I think as well as communities and families figuring out ways to build more hospitable and welcoming communities, we really need local governments and not-for-profits to come in on the action here as well, I think, and kind of invite them in. I mean, I say this with generous spirit. I know we have some foundations on the call today, which is fantastic. The potential that outside useful actors have to really contribute and support the building of community is very significant as well. We work, as you know, in Canada, and it's striking, you know, you're talking about what it is communities do. You know, $66.5 billion, Canadian dollars, is the equivalent. That's what it would cost you to buy the natural care that families create around their loved ones every year. Now, the last thing you would want to do is turn that into a commodity or a service. But it's an interesting way. In other words, there isn't enough money under the sun to pay for the level of care. But I don't necessarily like that argument, because what it does is it turns the whole argument into, oh, it's about, you know, the saving the country money. And I would say, I show the slide to make the point that I'm not saying that. what I believe asset-based community development is about is not about saving the country money. It's not about saving institutions money. You know, we heard in the UK, save our NHS. Bless them, you know, I get it. But really, you know, after clapping for the NHS, what about we clap for all the communities and what they did? You know, it's not about saving people in the institutions money. It's about saving people from institutions. And I think the way to do that is to actually create alternatives to institutions, to create community alternatives. So many families, Rachel, and so many good professionals have spent their lives and the lives of the loved ones they have banging their head against a brick wall, trying to get the school to be more inclusive, trying to get the doctor to be more responsive, trying to get, you know, the police to be less whatever. And I think one of the main reasons we rarely get a hearing is because typically we're dealing with folks who've been trained a bit like the psychologists in this picture to only see the symptom and only see the individual, you know, in terms of what they think is the problem. So they look at this poor koala and they label, they diagnose, they immediately, oh, the koala has a mental health problem. Well, actually, no. The koala is having a very healthy response to an environmental problem called deforestation. But they're trained not to see the deforestation. So, you know, many of our loved ones present with mental health problems. Actually, what they're presenting with is the loss of community problems. You know, we talk about people who are homeless. We don't talk about communities who are welcomeless, right? And we take the person by the one thing they don't have, a home, and then we make it about them. You know, or we try to find nicer language. So we talk about street involved. They're also community not involved, but that's not their fault. Or maybe their community is in a different context. I don't know. But what we want to try to do here is to try to convey this idea that you've got to see the whole picture. You know, when you're trying to be alongside folks, real people, you've got to actually understand that everybody is the same in a sense, in that we all need someone to love, somewhere to live, and something meaningful to do. And if we have environments and we have societies that organize in such a way where we say, what we're going to do to you now, Rachel, is we're going to organize you with all of the other Rachels and put you in a center for Rachels. And we're going to get people who are trained to only work with Rachels, and they'll have power and control, and they'll be the mediators, and they'll talk with a certain tone of voice to your family because they really think they're a bit thick. And they'll, you know, they'll sort of sort it out for you. And actually, in fairness to the Rachel professionals, they never signed up for this. They signed up because they believed they were going to change the world. They were going to be able to be caring. They were going to be able to do things that were different, right? So a big part of our challenge is how do we also kind of break down that sort of institutional blind spot and actually start seeing the environment. In Cincinnati, the Starfire Center, which was a very old style kind of day service where people with intellectual disabilities from neighborhoods across Cincinnati would be bused in the morning. They'd, you know, arrive, they'd go in and they would have their workstations and they would do an activity, an occupational activity, build something, make something. If it was Christmas, they'd make a Christmas log, whatever. About 5 or 6 years ago, took a really radical view. They said, well, what if the issues that the people we serve are not actually the lack of occupational training? It's not like the need, if you like, is not the need for what we're providing here in this workshop center. Let's ask them what they'd love. Let's ask them what a great life would look like. And of course, no surprise to anybody in this call, they all said, we want to be out, we want to be about, we want dates, we want mates, we want kind of, you know, normal life experiences. We want people to see that we have something to offer. And we want people to take seriously that the challenge we have is we have all of these gifts which people can't see because we've got this big, great label hovering over our head, which obscures the sight of our gifts. So we're going to need some support to participate, but we'd love to participate in real life, not in choreographed stuff, not in pretend work, right? And we'd love to do that with near neighbors most of the time, and not just salaried strangers and other people with the same labels as us? Do you think you could organize that? So this is like Rachel saying, I want, other Rachels are lovely, but I'd like to meet a Cormac, and I'd like to meet a John and a Joe, and see how that goes. So that was what they took seriously and they listened to. And today, if you went to the Starfire Centre, what you'd find is that the workshop placements are now basically occupied by local entrepreneurs and businesses. And in essence, they rent that space, and the money is handed to the folks that are being served, and they go back into the neighborhoods where they come from as community builders. They're all trained in ABCD, and they're going back in. So they're going back into the community to actually help build the connections, and the staff that were willing to have been retrained. And so they're both paid the same amount. They both are paid salaries, and they go back in. And the local government is charged a few bob as well, because it's a service to them. They go back in, and what they're doing is they're reweaving the social network that is broken down in those neighborhoods. So it's a real powerful reframe. Let me stop there, Rachel. Maybe you have some questions, or there's some comments that people might want to share. So I'll stop sharing for a moment, and we'll go back to the slideshow then. But
for sure. Thank you. And just to respond to a couple of things that you said there, from my own perspective, I think what is really shocking is that services don't necessarily realize that they can damage people's image and their reputation. And there seems to be a very, very difficult conversation needed to enable services to understand and to see and to believe that. And we have, in fact, within services, the wrong roles. I don't really want to sit and talk about services today, but this is where I'll just leave a few comments, that we have the wrong roles. So, what we have always advocated for in LEAP is soft roles, what we call soft roles around families, which would be, community navigators, community builders, community animators, individuals who can facilitate families to think about what is the vision of an ordinary life? How can I keep my family member on the typical, the normative, the ordinary life path, and really assist families down that route, that really life enhancing and enriching route. And that you said an awful lot there, but care has unfortunately become commodified. And like you in LEAP, we don't want to monetize care. We're not, interested in that, but we do profoundly recognize that some families do very much need paid support in their lives, but getting that paid support into right relationship is critical. And in order for that to happen, families need to understand what is family business, what is shared business, and what is service business. And as you say, not become disempowered by service workers who often lack boundaries and will just take over everything. So it's so important for us as families to hang on to and to grow our own power, and to try and bring in allies around our vision of an ordinary life, because we all need support to imagine better what a good life can look like. And I remember when my own son was quite small, hearing a really nice reflection from a woman who said, and I wrote it down here, that, try and find it now. She was talking about how important it is to really understand relationships and the value of relationships in our child's life. So the children that they go to school with when they're young will become their co-workers, will become their friends as adults. And really, I think that in the busyness of the young child's life, when there may be kind of issues around medical needs and aids and appliances, we can get caught up as family members on that merry-go-round of appointments. And what we forget then is, I suppose, what is really important as opposed to what is urgent, taking the child to these appointments and so on. And what we feel and what we've come to sort of really understand is that it's the relationships, the belonging and the ordinary roles, the valued roles in community, being the member of a club or a group or an association in your street, in your community or your village. And that we try and bring families back to that constantly, back to the weaving of community. You know, how can we knit this child into the ordinary fabric of community life? So there are just a few comments and reflections on what you said there, so that, you know, really positive introductions for your child are so important. And when we meet and we begin to engage with services, often they hold what we call a gross focus on the child's impairment. And, you know, we begin to almost parrot what they say about the child. We talk about what is wrong with them, any deficits, any impairments they may have. And we even actually unconsciously begin to talk about the child in that way to other people in our family, in our friendship circle, and in our community. And I suppose what it's helpful to recognize is that that doesn't necessarily help other people lean in. That doesn't necessarily help our child to belong. And, you know, how can we begin to tell a different story about our child that really focuses on their gifts, their talents, their assets, and what makes their eyes dance in their head? So I'm going to look at some of the comments coming in, and I think you can see them too.
I can't
Cormac,
actually.
yeah. And there's one here. There's one here from Zygmunt Bauman, or it's from Trevor, and he's talking about, I think that man is a sociologist, yeah. And he says, this reminds me of a comment by Bauman: community is like a fireplace at which we warm our hands on a frosty day. Well, that is really beautiful. Thank you, Trevor. You know, if we were just to pull back a little bit and think about the fact that families have a lot on their plate when they have a child or a brother or sister with a disability, they can find it quite overwhelming with all the busyness that may surround life to focus on connections. And what we see happen time and time again is that people become, you know, very isolated, and they can be living in a community but hidden in plain sight, so that they sort of, you know, pull up the drawbridge, and through a series maybe of negative experiences to which you alluded to, community isn't always welcoming and friendly. They withdraw, and they can stay in that situation for a very long time. So what are the things that families can do to begin to use what they have to get what they need? Any suggestions there, any thoughts, Cormac, for the beginning of that long journey back to community?
Well, the first thing I think is really important is to understand, I think this is a really good distinction. There is a difference between family relationships, friendships, and neighbors. If you try to get neighbors to be friends with your child, you're on a hiding to nothing. So what we're talking about here is neighborliness. That's an important distinction, because I think people conflate those two. And neighborliness is different. There is a way of growing up in a village or in an estate or on a street where you can create neighborliness, which from a stressed family perspective is a hell of a lot easier to create than creating friendships between, you know, kids in a class, for example. Because often what I can't read the comments, I'm sorry, so I'm
yeah, no, that's okay.
Blind, but I'm going to guess, I would imagine, right, that some parents are going to be saying, hang on, it's not that easy. And, you know, our child is, I mean, one of the things that I think regularly happens is the parents of other kids actually inhibit the impulse that their kid has around sustained friendship with the folks we love. I see that happening regularly. So I guess I'm not here. I mean, I have other thoughts on that, but not for today. I'm not here necessarily saying let's lean into that as a very, very complex and often heartbreaking space, and largely is kind of outside our sphere of influence. You know, so you almost end up just wanting to whack other parents sometimes, and it gets you into all kinds of emotional and psychic trouble. What I'm talking about is something that is, I hate to use the term low-hanging fruit, but it's something that I think very few people know about, and it's much easier to actually animate and kind of mobilize. And that's the idea of neighbor to neighbor connection, and how your child can have meaningful relationships in a neighborhood context. And it's remarkable. I remember in a community in Harborside in Scotland, noticing, it was actually Sean, a colleague of mine, noticed it, that every single morning, a gentleman who lived there who had a label would walk by, and this was just so noticeable because it was a long street, and would shut all of the gates along the street. So like, the first thing that strikes you when you see it, because Sean showed it to me one morning when I visited there, so like, what the hell are all the gates doing open out onto the pathway? Anyway, that doesn't make sense. But then you investigate it, and what you find is all of the neighbors, before they go to bed at night, open their gates out onto the road, so this gentleman can close them for them. Kind of go, that's remarkable. Like, how did that happen? You know, and you kind of you get into that, and then you discover that in all kinds of invisible ways, people have figured out that that's an important thing to do. That there's a local person. Sean would tell you about this, like names and addresses, you know, because that's what a community animator does. This guy was paid to find these people, you see. Imagine that as a resource if you're a parent and you're trying to connect somebody you love, and you've actually got a Sean who knows this.
Of course, right? Yeah.
Wow, my goodness. And that's where we have to be a bit realistic here, Rachel. You know, we can see, because like in many respects, to be fair to the professionals, our advocacy and our boundary setting is the rudder to their boat. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do it, or we turn up and we're frightened because we don't know how to hold that space. You know, it's anybody.
They'll fill that vacuum. Yeah.
But, you know, I think of Joop in Javastraat, which is a community in Amsterdam, a street in community in Amsterdam. And Joop never went outside. He lived with his mother. He was 46 years of age, and had all these kinds of labels, you know. And as you get older, then, you know, you've got your intellectual disability, but then you have all the mental health labels that kind. So he had multiple labels, you see, and sitting down and talking to his mom, and then talking to him up the stairs because he wouldn't come down. But he was curious, so he was asking his mother what she was talking about. And there was kind of, you know, all labels, I mean, paranoia, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it was the most interesting conversation I've had. Kind of a three-way conversation goes. It's a bit like watching politicians debating on RT. You know, it's all sorts of stuff flying. But what came out of that conversation was he had a great love of stamp collecting. And out of stamp collecting became really, really very knowledgeable about plants. And long story short, he began to start to accept the invitation to become the guy who looks after plants when people go on holidays. And it's just kind of an interesting one because, and I mean, I don't know whether this resonates for people, but I think that, you know, you look at that gentleman for 46 years who essentially was exiled from community life. And you can get into, maybe he did it himself, maybe his mother did it, maybe they should, you know, all of that. But the bottom line was, and the harsh reality was, that here was a gentleman with all kinds of gifts to offer when it came to botany, but no way of ever, even himself, I don't think he knew he had that gift, quite frankly. but certainly had no way of offering that gift in all seriousness. And so I think, to be fair to families, to be fair to that woman, to be fair to Yoke, I think that there is something that needs to happen at neighborhood level that supplements and supports families. And, I think it's not to leave us off the hook. I think I have a responsibility to my brother, and, and will do all of the practical things in sort of really being with him, knowing his gifts, knowing what he loves, knowing what his likes are, doing the positive introductions, making those connections. I'm happy to do that. But I also know that there are certain people I can tap into who are great animators and will accelerate that process for me. I know, for example, in every neighborhood that there are askers. And these are people who naturally, if they say to somebody who won't accept my brother, I'll vouch for him, then Kevin will be accepted. I know to ask that. And I think this is some of the knowledge that I hope will be helpful to families today. That those people are in communities, and like a good carpenter can put their hands, like my father, my late father used to be able to do this. He would put his hands on wood. And anybody who knows anything about carpentry will understand what I'm about to say next. And he'd close his eyes and he'd run, his hands were very calloused from work, but he'd run his hands, close his eyes along the wood, and he was looking for the green of the wood. And then he would cut, in sympathy to the grain, as he would put it. I cut in sympathy to the grain. We have to find ways of understanding the grain of community. And most of the time, I think what families and what professionals are doing, so it's both, is going against the grain. And then we get hurt and we get further isolated. And we have another story that compounds the other story that says the community are hostile places. So what's the point? So there's just two thoughts there just to lift up. One is that neighboring is different than friendship, right? The second thought is that communities have grains, right? Perhaps the third bonus point is there's askers in communities who will broker your children into meaningful relationships and contributions and social roles that you won't be able to, perhaps in all instances.
Yeah, I think when I got to this point with my own son, it was necessary for us as a family to take a holiday from services, just to take a break from being on that sort of hamster wheel and to really reflect on where it was we wanted to get to, and to take some time to think about, was it powerful to connect our assets, and that was very new language for us as a family, with services, and were we getting any kind of leverage there, or was there a better place to try and connect our assets? And that service holiday, that break from services, is not something the service is ever going to suggest to you, because their answer is, their prescription is more of what they offer, clearly. So, again, I would encourage families who are having these kind of thoughts that more service involvement in their family member's life is not really adding up to a good life, a valued life, a rich, meaningful life, to perhaps pause or take a break from service involvement in their family member's life and really focus on where is it that we're trying to get to? What is the vision? And then start to think about who might be allies, who are perhaps the natural supports in your life that can assist you with that. Now, I know many families who will say, well, there's nobody, Rachel, there's nobody. And I remember one family, we're still traveling with them. They're an extraordinary family, but the first time I sat with them at their kitchen table, which is where a lot of LEAP's work happens, there was the daughter of a neighbor, a teenage girl showed up. And that was just so powerful, because this young woman had such a great take on what it was that was required to stitch, knit, weave this young boy into the fabric of their community. And to listen to her speak was extraordinary. And to really listen to her, we learned so much that day. And I think actually that family are on the call today, and you know who you are. And I've learned so much from that family, that the people who show up should show up around the question, who here loves this child? Who here loves this child? And if it is only one or two people, so be it. That's a very powerful beginning. And as you say, Cormac, distinguishing between, neighborliness and the need for friendship, and, really discerning the difference, I think is also very powerful. So thank you for that.
Not at all. I think the other distinctions, and I'll share some more thoughts as well via the slideshow, but like the other distinctions that are really important here is if you imagine yourself, your family, and your community as being on the set of Downton Abbey, services are in the service quarters, the servants' quarters. And I mean that with no disrespect to professionals, but that's where we are. I'm providing a service now. I'm supplementing your wisdom. I'm not the expert. But I think this is a really important thing. So it's the mindset piece, right? So if I spend the winter taking vitamins and not eating food, I'm going to become sick. But if I eat food and I supplement my food with vitamins, I will probably get through the winter better than I would without the vitamins. Services are the vitamins. In a lot of cases, they're supplements, as the Americans would say, supplements, right? They supplement, they should not, and they can never replace a loving, caring, vibrant family, friendship network, and community. It just isn't, services aren't designed that way. But in the Irish context, we have created a rather confused set of conversations, which means that in a lot of instances, families have had their head turned in the direction of saying, here I have somebody with a problem, fix them. And services come in and, do whatever it is that they feel needs doing. And I think what we're saying here, quite honestly, is it's not services good, community bad, or vice versa. But it's about, if you want yourself, let alone the person you love who is labeled or exiled, but if you yourself want a good life, then a good life is not found in the marketplace or in service land. It's found primarily in natural relationships. And where do we find relationships? In family, friendship groups, and in community. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that they come baggage free? No. I mean, my goodness, have you ever been to an Irish wedding? Of course it's not baggage free, but that's not the point. That's life, life's a terminal condition. For example, we all die, so that's the gig. There are limits and there are problems. And each day we recommit. You can't fully commit to community until you've been disenchanted by community. Community, like family, like friends, will let you down. But somewhere along the line, you'll find enough of the sustenance and nutrients to give you and those you love a good life and the chance to contribute to the good life of others. But you can't do that without surprise, without risk. Now, one of the metaphors that I use a lot in my work is the metaphor. Well, it's not a metaphor, it's a nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty. And I think it's very relevant to where we are in our conversation. That I want to share a few principles that I think are useful, and a story, if I may, about doing this work. Because if you haven't ever actually seen a connected community, it's quite a stretch to imagine one. And in a sense, this is an exercise in imagination. Mind you, if I told you the story of what happened in communities back in March and April 10 years ago, you'd have found that hard to imagine as well. But, I think there's just something around the nursery rhyme that's really interesting to me, because it kind of proves that our head is turned in a certain direction. So whenever you hear the nursery rhyme, 1 1/2, 2, 3, you hear Humpty Dumpty set in the wall. Read that as you will. I kind of think about that as a so-called vulnerable person, right? Either cracked or about to, in some way, right? Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, so there you go, boom, right? There's been a crisis, there's been a trauma. And then, like, there's a whole piece missing, but essentially they fall into service land. How did that happen? Wow, that's interesting. What's all the piece in between? But don't worry, because all of the king's horses and all the king's men are going to do their best, you know. And after expose, there's going to be a reform, and then there's going to be another expose, and then they're going, you know, they're going to do their best, and the king is going to put as much money into training these people and sensitivity training and, you know, inclusion training, and, you know. And still, as the moral of the nursery rhyme reminds us, they won't put Humpty back together again. So this is a harsh reality, and this is the heartbreaking reality that every single family member and ally has to, I think, really accept. But Parker Palmer says that the heart can break in two ways. The heart can break, right? And you can be broken emotionally. But the heart can also break like a muscle breaks down so that it becomes stronger. It opens up new possibilities. And what I'm inviting is that kind of heartbreak, the heartbreak that deals with the harsh reality, that institutions aren't designed to care. They're designed to provide services and programs, and that's fine. Dogs bark. You don't get angry with them when they bark. Institutions provide goods, services. That's what they do. Let's not be angry with them when they don't provide love, care, and affection, a family and home, and friends. They can't.
They can't.
That's where, you know, shared lives and where your work in Leap, and look, you know, there are all kinds of clever ways that we can organize institutions so that they cheer us on. They support those connections. They maybe give us a few bops so we can participate, right? Judith Snow, you know, whose I think wisdom arches over this conversation, the great Canadian, who was the first person in Ontario to get money and income instead of services. John McKnight, the great founder of ABCD, asked her 3 years after she got her money, called personal budget, income, right? Said, so Judith, with all of this, well, she got about $120,000 because she needed quite a lot of things in order to participate and share her gifts. By the way, that's what the money was for. But John said, so how much of it did you use to purchase any of the services that the systems world provided for you previous to you having money? And she said, not one. Not one. And it's fascinating, you know, and I think about it myself, and I provide services. The great question you can ask as a professional, if you're a professional, right, on this call, because we're not slagging off professionals, that's an important point. But if you're a professional in this call and you say, a great question to ask is, if this person that I'm serving, if this family that I'm serving had my salary, would they use my salary to buy the service I'm proposing for them now? The answer, I would say 99.9% of the time is no. So somehow we're constantly missing the mark, aren't we? And part of that is because we measure success in Ireland in the disability sector, world, whatever the language is these days, I can't keep track. But we measure it by the number of people in our programs and the quality of our programs, rather than the quality of life and how interdependent the folks that we care for are in natural communities. Now, I don't want to get rid of services. I know there are people on the call. My father, before he died, would say to me, and he was of his generation, you know, they're closing down all of these places and they're trying to get my brother into community care. And it's all a cod. It's all a con. It's just to save money. They'll send him into places where he won't have any real relationship. And, you know, he was right in a lot of ways. There wasn't proper, meaningful brokerage, good building. He wasn't in reciprocal relationships, and we had to kick mighty stink up to actually make that happen. So I live in the real world, right? My brother is 50 odd years of age, been around that block, and I'm still knocking barks off the institution. I'm not finished with them yet. But you have to set the anger aside, because I think the difficulty is so bloody exhausting. And it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun sometimes too, by the way.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun. So there's a bit of an addiction to it. But in those moments, I am not building the bloody relationships with the people who'll be there on the days I'm not. And that's what stops me going to sleep at night. I'm in Dublin, he's in Limerick. There's practicalities here. He wants to live in the family home. He wants to have his own life.
Can I just,
boy, that's complicated.
Yeah. Can I just read a lovely comment there that's come in? Patricia says, this is so important, Cormac. When your child is young, you are so vulnerable to being easily offended, over defensive, and to feel bitterly disappointed and push people away and isolate yourself. So thanks for that, Patricia. There's another couple of comments have come in where obviously people feel this is a safe space and there's no way that I would judge this, but people are saying, look, it's really hard. Families don't necessarily want their child to play with our child. And a bit like your comment about the heartbreaking, it's like the heart breaks, but then what? What happens to people and families when hard times unfold is one of the foundational questions that Leap always comes back to. And what I would say to families is, look, before you had a child or children with a disability, did you encourage your child to play with other children who were excluded in your community? And if you did, you're amazing, and that's fabulous. But I suggest to you that many of us didn't. And it was only when our lives were so profoundly touched by the exclusion of someone we loved that our hearts began to break, and we began to see, oh my goodness, this is really hard. This is really hard. And what we did with that question or that realization was often attack others and blame them. But it may be useful for us to sit with that suffering long enough to realize that actually we were the same before our own child came into our lives. So, yeah.
There's the great tragedy in life for every human being, regardless of how the world may label them. And there's no such thing as the world. Some people in the world may label them, is that they live their lives not knowing that they have a gift, that every single person has a gift. And the world is not complete until that gift is seen, given, and received. There is no exception to that. Now, the great gift that we've received as family members and as people who are blessed to be paid to be alongside family members and people who are journeying from exile back into the center of community life is they have come to remind us that remembering our communities is at the heart of what it means to be human. So without that heartbreak and without that challenge in our lives, then we can't actually passage into real fulfillment, into real well-being. That's my belief. I firmly believe, in ancient indigenous traditions, there was a belief that every human being was born with a gift, a genius. It's where the word genius comes from, geni, in North Africa. And it's this idea that every person has something to contribute to the well-being of their community. And sadly, in kind of modern life, we don't think about that. Most of our kids kind of, grow up, we do the best by them, and they go off and go to college and do whatever they do. But every so often, and it comes in different ways, but every so often, there's a challenge to figure out how we're going to grow a community where everybody's gift can be received, right? And it's almost like, in a sense, the pandemic forces people to do things they don't want to do, right? Nobody would wish a pandemic. Nobody would wish this. But what's been interesting, say, if I think about my relationship with my brother, I have, in many respects, probably come to where I am today because of my journey as a brother with him. I don't think I would have found my way to community any other way. My parents weren't necessarily big community people. They didn't volunteer. My father thought meetings were a joke. I kind of agree with him. So it wouldn't have happened, but really, that our hearts were broken in that very real way. And I suppose a bit like you were saying, Rachel, have I frozen?
No.
Oh, no.
No, you haven't frozen.
A bit like you were saying, Rachel, you know, the kind of sense of as a family, when we begin to realize and accept the limits of the institutional world and really listen to what Kevin wanted as a good life, it became pretty clear that we had to find a way of supporting those relationships. And I think, you know, sadly, both my parents are dead now. But, you know, within that, there's still that legacy remains, that idea that, you know, we hear a lot of people over the years, you know, forming a circle of support. And, you know, it all was great. It really was. We're battling now around personal budgets, and that'll come, you know, in its own good time as well. But I think what has made the greatest difference in my brother's life is that actually he has neighbor to neighbor connections. Mostly that's what makes the difference. And that's an ongoing journey, because quite frankly, a lot of those connections are with older people who are dying themselves.
Yes, yeah.
It's an ongoing challenge. I wonder, Rachel, would it be useful if I shared a few other thoughts about ABCD at this point before we finish, or do you just want
Please
to keep
do. No, please do.
Yeah.
And we've lots of comments and questions coming in. And I just encourage people, when you're in the chat, you have a little blue box there, and you can either put your comment in to all panelists, which just means on this call, me and Cormac will see them, or you can change the tick to all panelists and attendees. So that means everybody can see them. And I think some of the stuff that's coming in, all of it it's great if everybody can see it. So just perhaps have a look at that before you post your comment.
Incidentally, just so we understand the two worlds, right? It's really important to understand that there's two different rules at play in the world of family and community and in the world of institutions, right? So one of the basic things to know here is that if you're an institutional person, if you're a professional and you go to work, and some of you are both, by the way, right? Mm-hmm. So I am too. So we kind of cross these worlds and we see them as one world because they're in the same place. But what's interesting is if I go into the institutional world, it's almost as if I hang up all my deficits, all of my shortcomings, all of my fallibilities, right? So you don't go into an institution like the NHS and, you know, and sit around for a family conference and go around the table and have all of the professionals and all the social workers say, hi, my name is Mary. I'm the senior social worker here today for whatever area. And I have profound issues with alcoholism, feel depressed a lot of the time, and Jesus, my husband just drives me crazy. Nice to meet you, and pass on. So what ends up happening is all the professionals introduce themselves by their assets, which are largely credentials, and their expertise. They lead with that, right? And then we in family life introduce ourselves by all of the things that are wrong with us. And we even add some extra because it kind of seems like that's the thing to do.
Well, you get more services, the more you can perform, but you're desperate.
You know, that's the dance. It's like, I don't know if any of you ever have a needy friend that you can never get off the call. You know, it's just kind of, that you're the needy friend. And the interesting thing is that actually all of those professionals are as, substitute a naughty word in here, they're as messed up as we are. They're as human and as fallible and as, you know, and that's, you know, so I can take an alcoholic, homeless person and bring them into my neighborhood and say, I'd never fit in here. I'd never make any connections here. I can say, well, you see, just up there at that house, let me tell you that guy's story. His real story, you know, and he's got as many problems as you do. And it's just dumb luck that he's there and you're here, you know? So in many respects, I think what we have to do is we have to change the nature of that story and at least do ourselves the service of not doing ourselves down in order to get the funds to build us up again. Because that's the rule of the game. Run your child down so you can get the funding so that you can build them back up. And guess what? It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't, because you never build them back again. You damage their reputation.
You don't get a second chance to make a first impression.
No.
So, you know, it's really, really important. But let me just, I mean, I get carried away. But let me just say a few quick pieces on ABCD. So in practical terms, I wanted to share a very brief story. Now, a lot of our stories, a lot of the way we work is kind of, you know, we work on the belief that sometimes what people need most is on their doorstep, but it's really hard to connect to. So it's there, but it's really hard to connect to. Like there was a whole lot of stuff that now is in an iPhone that previously was disconnected. The great innovation was putting it together. The hard part was actually seeing that it needed to be connected. That's the tough work. There's nothing easy about that, but it's not technically hard. It's kind of, it's more about courage. And it's really interesting as well that so often we've approached disability as if it's a technical problem to fix, rather than a relational opportunity to celebrate. And I think when we recognize that the issue isn't disability, it's not the issue. That the challenge is to take that which people see as a problem and to breathe love and life into it to such an extent that the gift within it can be revealed and received. So that people who are defined as the problem can be received and they can redefine the problem. That happens at your doorstep, and it really is quite striking. A lot of outside agencies are asking, how can they help families? What can they do for families? If you're on this call and you're a foundation person or an agency, try asking the question, how can I support families and communities to have a bit of space? My God, it is so incredibly, brutally hard sometimes to do what I'm describing. But sometimes all it's about is a bit of space, a bit of brokerage, you know, a bit of encouragement. And somebody saying to you, you know, the last thing you need me to do to your child is institutionalize them. But have you thought about this? So using your influence to open up space and really invite people to have that confidence. This is a bit of a complicated, convoluted slide. I do apologize. But it's really interesting here in Latino communities we're working with in the States. They've begun to realize around domestic violence, can you believe, that actually the capacities of the communities are really critical. Taking women out of domestic violence, putting them in shelters, giving them a little bit of respite, doesn't really get to the root of the issue. It keeps them safe, and that's important. But it's a crisis response. It is not a long-term sustainable response, you know? And we want to live a good life across the arc of our lives with those we love. And we don't want to do it always stuck in the domain as being a problem that somebody else is trying to fix. You know, because we're not. Disability is not a problem to fix, right? So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways I think of doing it is not to go in through the door of disability, or even to go in through the door of inclusion. You know, the trick I think here is to actually think less about including your son, your daughter, yourself, and more about how do we actually build this place into a community? And what can the people I love and myself do and others do to make that happen? So it becomes a collective effort. It's almost like the neighborhood becomes the primary unit of change. Tell you a quick story about this before we run out of time. So I met these three people in the photograph here. They came to a workshop that Rachel was at. You may or may not remember this, Rachel. I chose it because they were at the workshop in Croydon that we were at. And they just got bitten by this bug. They said, do you know what, actually, we're going to go back to our neighborhood in Leicestershire in a place called Colville, an old mining village. And we're going to ask people in the neighborhood, I mean, it takes some gumption to do this. We're going to ask people in the neighborhood what they're prepared to contribute to the community. Not to our son, not to our daughter, not to our cause, not to the environment, to our community. And they did. They actually went out on the streets, about 7 or 8 of them, and had conversations. And one of them was an artist, and they created this portrait of some of the conversations. Now, this is only a kind of a top slice of what they came up with. But what they actually are portraying here is the hidden treasures of Colville. All of the slivers of inclusion that are largely invisible. And I think one of the challenges is, and they face this challenge, is how do we make the invisible visible? And it won't just happen. It won't just happen. And it won't happen by more inclusive schools. It won't permeate out. I mean, most of our schools are like fortresses, right? It won't permeate out from schools mostly. Some are great. But, you know, it's got to happen in the neighborhood. And it's interesting, these guys, they're serious players. So even when, as local residents and families, they're talking to outside agencies, they invite funders. So they interview foundations to fund them. And the foundations are actually lining up around the block, because what they're doing is making such a phenomenal difference at so many levels. I haven't a lot of time, but I just thought I'd share a couple of quick principles, well, 8 actually quick principles with you. But just before I do that, Rachel, I just wanted to say, I think it's hard to see this, but what I have seen through thousands of neighborhoods all over the world, from the Rift Valley in Kenya to Roscommon, is that there are associations, there are clubs, there are groups, there are small social networks, and they are largely invisible to people who are interested in inclusion and interested in disability. And they are waiting to be asked. I promise you, I know it to be true. I can empirically prove it to be true, but hardly anybody ever does. It is the best kept secret on the planet.
Wonderful.
So the 8 principles to leave you with, right? And I hope that instead of heartbreak, this gives you hope and sustains you in the moments of heartbreak, which are inevitable, but hopefully make us stronger. So the first, I think, principle of what I'm saying is that the neighborhood is the primary unit of change. Not your son, not your daughter, not your family. It takes a village to raise a child. So you can't do it on your own. And it is not fair to expect you to do it on your own. And give yourself a break. You know, now talking to people during the pandemic a few months ago, says, you know, make friends with your neighbors before you need them. But just do it with 2 or 3 people, you know. Find a threshold that works for you. Small is beautiful. We don't have to get the whole neighborhood involved. And if you can't do it on your own, have a really keen eye to look out for those askers, those connectors, those people who know to go house to house and say, John likes closing your gate in the morning. If you wouldn't mind, would you leave it open at night? And by the way, everybody else is doing the same thing. So you're not the odd one out. I'm asking everybody to do that. Cheers. And they've got the nature that when they ask, it gets done, right? Who are they? Focus on what's strong, not what's wrong. Hardest thing to do, but actually lift up not the shortcomings of yourself, your family, and your community, but the strengths. If we can do it for institutions, we can do it for ourselves, you know? So start with what's strong and use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong even stronger still, you know? So really beginning, and this isn't Pollyanna thinking, this isn't just, you know, be positive for the sake of it, but really recognizing that in all kinds of ways, that if we want to have a good life and we want to participate and contribute, we can't contribute the half-empty part of ourselves. I can't contribute what I don't have. I've got to contribute what I have. I've got to use what I have to secure what I need. Another word for that is my resource or my strength. So use it. And in all kinds of ways, what we have in our communities is hidden. It's hidden in plain sight, like the sundial and the shade. And in many respects, I think we have to sharpen our senses to go and look for it, you know. Hard to see because, you know, so often maybe we're interpreting what we're seeing through the lens of disability, through the lens of exclusion, through the lens of if only the institution could do it for me. But I think when we get past all of those and we begin to see ourselves as agents of change, as not somebody else's effect, but as cause in our lives. You know, I often think that children raise their parents, pupils teach their teachers, and patients heal their doctors. And people with so-called disabilities reweave their communities. It doesn't just take a village to raise a child. It actually takes a child to raise a village. That's the piece we keep missing. So often what is most strong seems to be most wrong. You see the solution's in the problem because it was never a problem to begin with. So when we remove the labels, when we actually remove the labels, I mean, Leonard Cohen said it well, didn't he? He said, you ring the bells, you still can ring. So forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Where's the strength? So I think another principle is about speed, Rachel. You know, we're constantly, we're going at, we want it yesterday. We want it sorted, you know, where our heart is breaking. Why can't it be now? Institutions are on the line are the same. Why can't we get this done in 3 years? We have a 3-year funding cycle. The politicians are the same. Let's get it done in a 5-year funding cycle. I want the praise. If I can't get it, be damned, the next politician, the next party. All of that, it's the wrong pace. We've got to do this at the speed of trust. If we go faster, we leave people behind us. So learning to move at the speed of kairos, not chronos, moving at the speed of trust, right? Moving at the speed of whatever it is, wherever it is, whoever it is, however it is. That's where it is. It's all relational. And it can't be any faster. A lot of the time, one of the other key principles, we spend a lot of time trying to help our child be resilient, help the person we love build individual agency. That's great. It's okay. But actually, what sometimes we fail to understand is the real trick is developing the collective agency of the community to receive the gifts of our child. So we put so much pressure on the child, you know, don't let the bully know he's affecting you. What about the class learning how to actually build a beloved community? You know, so the collective agency is really important. And I would be very, very clear with local authorities and NHS trusts and foundations and whatever, if they're not actually investing in place-based ways of working and building collective agency in classrooms and workplaces and communities, in many respects, they're failing, they're falling asleep at the wheel. Another principle I love, Rachel, is change begins where community begins, on our doorstep. You know, we don't have to go off and find community. Community is a verb, not a noun. Community is something you do. And it's not something we can commission or get prescribed for us. It's something that we have to actually co-create with our neighbors. And in many respects, I think it's important to say that's not about, you know, we talked a lot about agencies and professionals and whatever. That's kind of not about saying agencies are bad or institutions are bad. Too much of anything is bad for you, right? It's about getting the right proportion. So there will be times when it'll be very helpful to have a service or a program or whatever, but it's about right relationship. Indigenous communities teach us this, right? It's all about how can you get in right relationship. So here's a little graphic that kind of says most of what we do to create inclusion, have a good life, to participate in the economy, in our society and well-being, we do by ourselves. It's done in families, with our personal agency, with our neighbors, with our friends. We muddle along. By the way, that's true in organizations too. It's really interesting to think about this. You know, organizations think that largely they are what they are as a result of their leadership and their structures, right? They're not, and I can prove it. Let's take the NHS, right? And let's tomorrow declare that everybody in the NHS or in the HSE only works to rule. Everything would grind to a halt. In fact, that would have much greater impact on the productivity of the HSE than the hack. Because every single day, love, care, ingenuity, and workarounds are what actually make the HSE work. So local people dealing with a clunky system and at human scale, finding ways to make it work. But there's no place like a family and a community to make that happen. That's the piece. I mean, so many people will spend their lives, you know, trying to turn the factory of the school into a family environment. And some will succeed. I know some beautiful school environments that feel more family than factory. But let's remember, we also have family. We also have community. And I think that's the nursery within which a lot of this stuff can happen. So there are things we can do by ourselves with our communities. There are things we need some help with. And then there are things we do need done for us. Let's hope and pray that when they're done with respect and with, I think, an appreciation of power. A lot of families, Rachel, have been treated like recipients of funding or like sources of information. They get survey after survey, asked their opinion, but they're never really asked their opinion. They're asked for information about what the service is like. So they're treated like consumers. Some of the lucky ones are invited to the captain's table to sit as advisors and advocates. But at all of those rungs of the ladder, it's still service land. And I think what we're talking about today is we're talking about families and residents, because we can't do this in isolation. This is not a single issue. We're talking about the beloved community and not just disability. We're talking about homeless. We're talking about Syrian refugees being included. We're talking about homelessness. We're talking about the community finding a way of actually saying, how can we live together? Where our brothers, our sisters, our planet's keepers are all in this. We're figuring it out. We're not just consumers of a service, but we're producers of a good life. That's what we're talking about. And in a sense, and maybe I'll finish with this, I think it comes down to these three questions. And you mentioned them earlier on, for families and for communities. Whatever your challenge, whatever your issue, the sequence matters here. The first question to ask is, what is it we can do ourselves alone? Maybe with the help of our neighbors, maybe with the help of, but with near neighbors, not salaried strangers. What is that? What are those possibilities? You can't find them out until you ask the question. And once you ask the question, the next step is to be curious, to go searching, to go looking with fresh eyes and fresh perspective. What are those things? And if you're an institutional person, imagine if that's where you started. What is the community and family alternative to what I'm about to do? My institutional response. And how could I launder the money that I was going to use to set a program up? Launder is the wrong word, by the way, but I can't think of a better one. How can I throw the money over the king's horses and king's men side of the wall into the community side? And resource, because sometimes that money can be a disaster sometimes, but sometimes a little bit of it can be very helpful. It creates a bit of space. The second question is, what is it communities can do themselves, but with a little bit of outside help that is respectful? Right? So that help is just there as supplementary help, not dominating. So the institutions are the backseat drivers, but in some ways they're kind of just adding some extension to capacity. And then the final question is, what's left that the institutions can do best, but they can do in a transparent, open, respectful way. So the wounded healers that, are in all our institutions and is within me don't become wounding healers, but find ways of actually really doing what it was that they signed up to do, which is to be alongside folks and to support them to have their best possible life. So let me finish, Rachel, by reframing the nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty. So I would commend the following version. Humpty Dumpty sat in the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. But all of his neighbors were ready to catch. They built him a nest where he safely did hatch.
Lovely, beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.